It began, as many great downfalls do, with a knock at the door, one that history remembers not for its sound, but for the echoes it left in the heart of a nation. In the summer of 1791, Alexander Hamilton, former aide-de-camp to Washington, co-author of the Federalist Papers, the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury, opened his door to a woman named Maria Reynolds. What followed was not merely a scandal of infidelity, but a tangled web of politics, ambition, betrayal, and power that would haunt Hamilton's legacy and stain the office he helped build. For what is more American, perhaps, than the marriage of sex and politics, veiled behind the illusion of public virtue? Maria Reynolds came not as a seductress, but as a supplicant. Her story was simple, almost rehearsed. Her husband had abandoned her, she was poor, desperate, and in need of help. Hamilton, by his own confession, offered her financial support and, allegedly, his heart. But what began as an affair quickly spiraled into something far more dangerous. James Reynolds, Maria's estranged husband, reappeared, not as a wronged man, but as a blackmailer. And Hamilton, the architect of America's economic system, found himself paying hush money from his own pocket, hoping to protect his reputation, his career, and perhaps even his family. But the story does not end in that dark room, behind closed doors. In fact, it had only just begun. By 1797, whispers had become accusations. Hamilton's rivals, particularly Thomas Jefferson's allies, began investigating his financial dealings, suspecting him not only of personal moral failure, but of corruption in public office. Political enemies like James Monroe, Frederick Muhlenberg, and Abraham Venable confronted Hamilton with evidence of payments to the Reynoldses. They believed, perhaps hoped, that Hamilton had embezzled public funds. Here lies the first fracture between the official record and the shadows beneath it. In his now infamous Reynolds pamphlet, Hamilton publicly admitted to the affair, publishing a 95-page document that shocked the country with its candor. He insisted he had committed adultery, yes, but had not committed financial fraud. He had sinned, he said, as a man, not as a statesman. The public reaction was volcanic. Hamilton's enemies rejoiced. His allies staggered in disbelief. His political career, once poised for the presidency, was irrevocably shattered. But what truly motivated Hamilton to publish such a devastating confession? Here the historical accounts diverge, not in facts, but in interpretation. Some scholars, particularly in the United States, have lauded his honesty, painting Hamilton as a tragic figure, a man so wedded to honor that he would destroy himself to protect the truth. European historians, however, often take a more cynical view. In British and French analyses of the affair, Hamilton is less a martyr and more a manipulator, someone who weaponized his own scandal to divert attention from more serious financial misdeeds. A few even question whether Maria Reynolds was truly the instigator or merely a pawn in a scheme orchestrated by her husband, or perhaps by political operatives seeking Hamilton's downfall. And then there is the folklore, the oral tradition that surrounds the Reynolds affair like mist around a battlefield. In some accounts, Maria Reynolds later confessed to being paid by Jeffersonian allies to entrap Hamilton. In others, she is remembered as a woman genuinely in distress, used and discarded by powerful men. None of these stories can be fully verified, yet they persist, passed down not through archives, but through anecdotes, private letters, and second-hand testimonies. They hint at something deeper, more unsettling, that the truth of the Reynolds affair may not lie in the public documents, but in what was deliberately left out. Hamilton's enemies, of course, capitalized on the moment. Thomas Jefferson, ever the tactician, allowed the scandal to bloom without directly engaging it. Aaron Burr, yes, the same Burr who would one day kill Hamilton in a duel, kept his distance, but surely took note. The Federalist Party, once unified, began to splinter under the weight of internal moral outrage, and Eliza Hamilton, Alexander's long-suffering wife, remained stoic, silent, her heart shattered not by the affair itself, but by the fact that her husband had made it public. She burned many of their letters. We can only imagine what truths went with them. What remains then is a puzzle with pieces missing. The Reynolds Affair has often been reduced to a salacious footnote in American history, a simple case of lust and blackmail. But when examined closely, when we look not only at what Hamilton wrote, but what others didn't, it becomes something far more complex. It is a story about power and its price, about the thin line between public virtue and private vice, and about how one man's attempt to control his own narrative may have exposed a far greater set of secrets buried within the young republic. And perhaps that was always the point. Perhaps in trying so hard to confess, Hamilton revealed more than he intended, not just about himself, but about the nation he helped create. Because in a country built on ideals, it is the imperfections that endure longest in memory. It was in the hot summer of 1797 that the political tremors finally surfaced. James Monroe, yes, the future president, and two other prominent Jeffersonians had obtained copies of the letters and confessions exchanged between Hamilton and James Reynolds years earlier. Monroe, in a moment of discomforted propriety, handed them to Thomas Jefferson's ally, the newspaperman James Callender. Callender, a venomous pamphleteer with a vendetta, soon exploded Hamilton's secret life into the public eye. The article was salacious, damning, and deeply personal. But more than anything, it was designed to destroy the myth of Hamilton's moral superiority. Faced with a political and personal disaster of unimaginable scale, Hamilton did something few public men would dare to do. He admitted the affair publicly. In a lengthy 95-page pamphlet, now known as the Reynolds pamphlet, Hamilton laid out in excruciating detail the entire sordid timeline. He disclosed every note, every secret rendezvous, every humiliating payment. He confessed not just to the affair, but to the vulnerability, the recklessness, the hubris. It was the first time in American history that a high-ranking statesman had aired his personal sins so graphically in an effort to preserve his political integrity. But did it work? According to the official narrative, Hamilton's confession cleared him of charges of financial misconduct. In the eyes of many contemporaries, it was an act of bold honesty. But the public was less forgiving. The Hamilton, who had once towered as a giant of Federalist virtue, now seemed diminished, exposed, not only for his private failings, but also for his obsession with control, and perhaps his naive belief that truth alone could save a reputation. Yet even within this apparent transparency, contradictions persisted. Some historians argue that his confession was a masterstroke of misdirection, that by focusing entirely on the sexual scandal, Hamilton cleverly diverted attention from deeper financial improprieties. After all, James Reynolds had been involved in fraudulent speculation, and Hamilton had continued contact with him even after the affair. Were the hush payments solely to cover an affair, or to silence someone who might have exposed something much more sinister? The folk narratives, whispered across taverns and dinner tables, tell a darker tale. In some versions, it was Maria Reynolds herself who was the manipulator, a tool of Jeffersonian sabotage. In others, she is portrayed as a victim, a young woman coerced into an affair by a powerful man who saw her suffering as an opportunity. Even European observers found the story both bizarre and familiar. French newspapers, already cynical from their own revolution, described the pamphlet as the most tragic comedy of modern republicanism. In England, satirists compared Hamilton to ancient tragic heroes who fell not by the sword, but by the softness of their hearts. As the scandal unfolded, Hamilton's Federalist allies recoiled, while his enemies rejoiced. His wife, Eliza Schuyler Hamilton, remained with him, though whether out of duty, forgiveness, or private calculation is a matter that remains shrouded in silence. She burned much of their correspondence after his death, perhaps to preserve what little dignity remained, or perhaps to erase things the world should never read. What makes the Reynolds Affair persist in cultural memory is not merely its drama, it is the eerie familiarity of it. A man in power, a scandal involving sex and money, a desperate attempt to control the narrative, and underneath it all, the unsettling sense that what we are told may not be the entire truth. Was Hamilton merely a man who sinned and confessed, or was he something more, a manipulator of perception, a master of selective transparency? As the affair faded from the headlines, Hamilton's career never fully recovered. Though he remained a powerful voice in Federalist politics, the myth of his invulnerability had cracked irreparably. But more than his political stature, it was the moral architecture of the early republic that had shifted. For the first time, Americans were forced to reckon with the personal lives of their leaders, not just their policies or ideals. And in this reckoning, something had been unspoken. A precedent was set. That even the founders, those deified architects of democracy, were men, ambitious, flawed, and capable of deceit.
When the storm of the Reynolds Affair finally broke over Alexander Hamilton's head, he chose a weapon of confession rather than silence, a weapon that few in power dared to wield so openly. In 1797, with trembling but calculated hands, he published the infamous Reynolds pamphlet, 38 pages of personal ruin. In it, he laid bare his affair with Maria Reynolds, claimed innocence of any financial corruption, and in the process, offered up his marriage, his dignity, and his future on the altar of political survival. No founding father had ever confessed to such a scandal in print before, and none would again. To his supporters, this act was bold, desperate perhaps, but truthful. To his enemies, it was a confession disguised as a distraction. Why admit to adultery with such humiliating detail unless the political crime was far worse? Some questioned if the financial dealings with James Reynolds truly ended where Hamilton claimed. Others whispered, was this merely the part of the iceberg he could not hide? In European accounts, observers were stunned, not by the affair itself, for such scandals were common among leaders, but by the American insistence on moral purity in public office. The French especially found it absurd that Hamilton's lovers mattered more than his fiscal policies. But closer to home, whispers deepened. Maria Reynolds vanished from the public eye. Her husband James faded just as quickly. The letters between Hamilton and Maria, some written in suspiciously similar handwriting, left historians wondering, were they all genuine? Was the affair real, or orchestrated by political enemies like Jefferson or Burr to dismantle Hamilton's power? After all, it wasn't only Hamilton's reputation that fell. It was his shot at the presidency. He would never fully recover. Even Eliza, his long-suffering wife, remained publicly silent about the affair for decades. Some say she burned his letters. Others claim she kept them until her dying day, unwilling to forgive, but unable to forget. Her silence echoes louder than any confession. And as for Hamilton, the man who shaped America's financial system, co-authored the Federalist Papers, and fought duels in defense of honor, his legacy would always carry a stain that no pamphlet could erase. Years later, when the duel with Aaron Burr finally ended his life, some looked back to the Reynolds Affair as the true beginning of his downfall. Not the bullet in Weehawken, but the moment he pulled back the curtain and revealed the man behind the Patriot. Was it courage, or a final desperate move in a game of power and reputation? No one truly knows. The Reynolds Affair remains more than a scandal. It is a crack in the marble statue of American myth, a reminder that even the nation's architects had shadows. And in that shadow, questions still linger. Was Hamilton merely a man who stumbled? Or did he fall while running from something far more dangerous? Whatever the truth, it lies buried, not in pamphlets or portraits, but in the space between silence and confession. And in that space, history watches, still waiting, still unsure.